Hello, I'm back again. Now, before I go further, yes, I'll be itching my nose a lot, and I've got bags in my eyes because it's late summer, allergies are everywhere, and the humidity is kind of making me melt, so that's why I'm all shiny. So, not talking about fairy tales or the state of American education, which is terrible. Today, I'm going to talk about something else, writing adjacent. So, I'm going to talk about genre fiction and how there are literary elites who turn their nose down at it. Now, genres are really actually not easy to define. Like, the term genre, I think, can be defined as a set of fiction which shares common tropes and plot conventions. But you notice how fuzzy that definition is? That's because genres are fuzzy. Even exemplars of a genre, like Frankenstein, are not purely one genre. Frankenstein's very exemplary as science fiction, but it's also horror. I mean, very gothic-y horror too, and yet it's both. Star Wars, I would consider that science fantasy because of the Force. Even with the whole midichlorian thing, there's still a lot of stuff in the Force that I think is more fantasy than science, and therefore, to me, Star Wars will be science fantasy. And something I don't get about the literary establishment is this whole, shall we say, snootiness towards genre fiction as opposed to literary fiction. Now, literary fiction, I can't actually find a definition of. Like, the one guy whose stuff they labeled literary fiction, he didn't like the label, because it literally means fiction in which there are words written, I think. But the way I've been able to define it from examples I've seen of literary fiction is it's realistic fiction. That's all it is. It's just realistic fiction with a fancy title on it. And that's kind of ridiculous to me, that this one segment of all of fiction gets to be considered superior when the rest of it gets called genre fiction and slapped off to the side. Now, I was reminded of this when I submitted something to be published in a magazine that I won't name because A, I've actually forgotten who they were, and B, they're not important to me. But there was this line in their email that stuck with me that makes me almost giggle. And that line was, "We do not publish genre fiction." I hate to break it to you, pals, but all fiction has a genre. Whether it be your precious literary stuff, which is realistic fiction, or the rest of it, science fiction, mystery, horror, fantasy, etc., etc. And even then, stuff does not neatly fall into different categories. Like, you can have a horror thing, but it could also be romance. Like a detective trying to solve the murder or something has a love interest, like some noirs do. Or, really, it's a love interest, but she's also the femme fatale, and it's a bad idea. But you get the idea. Genres are fuzzy and don't fit into neat categories. I mean, realistic fiction can't even be fully segregated from the rest of its family of genres, because you can write a realistic fiction piece, but also have it be a mystery. You can write a realistic fiction thing and it can be a thriller. You can write historical realistic fiction and have all those other subcategories. You can even do horror so long as the elements aren't supernatural and it still be set in reality. So, all fiction has a genre. It's ridiculous for these literary elites who run publishing stuff to turn their nose up at pretty much every book ever written, except for a small, narrow band of what they have considered good. And these are the same sort of hipsterish attitude people who seem to think that popular stuff isn't good or can't be good. Except sometimes it can be. Lord of the Rings. They're just now finally cottoning on to the fact that Lord of the Rings actually, despite its popularity, is good. Which we've known all along because we didn't have our noses up in the air. And that's where I think this quote from Tolkien comes from about literature being an escape, because it's the duty of all good soldiers to escape and take as many with them as possible. You should read to escape, and you should write to escape, and help other people escape. Which means sometimes, yes, writing realistic fiction can be that escape because you read about someone's life who's worse than yours, or you can get catharsis through someone else's tragedy, or personal failings. You can get some sort of like moral superiority of, haha, I'm not this dude cheating on his wife, I am better than him. Realistic fiction has its place, but its place should not be on a freaking pedestal, looking down at everyone else. Realistic fiction is just a genre, same as every other genre. And even that, it doesn't segregate out very nicely. Because what is science fiction of yesterday is becoming true today. Like, Star Trek predicted a lot of stuff we have today. So you can't even say that sci-fi and realistic fiction don't have crossover, because our technology could drive a plot. Like, you could have a thriller set today based around stuff that exists today. Usually it's a spy thriller, though. And that's still kind of like science fiction crossing into that whole realistic fiction thing. You can't have neat delineations with genre, and everything is a genre. So when I think about that line in that rejection email, we don't publish genre fiction. Yeah, you do. What you should really say is, we don't publish anything but realistic fiction that we narrowly defined as what we prefer. And that would be a much better, more honest line to write. Instead of saying, we don't publish genre fiction. Yes, you do. You just don't publish any genre but this. And that's okay. Literary stuff, like literature magazines, you can say that we only publish realistic fiction and people will get the picture. But when you say literary, I think Updike is the guy who wrote stuff that people can classify as literary fiction, who doesn't like the term. So that basically means words on a page. So writing that you publish literary fiction, well, no shit, Sherlock, swear jar. Everyone publishes literature, because it's words on a page. It's just ridiculous to me that you've decided, out of all of fiction, to narrow your worldview to only those few things that are like a John Grisham book, because I think that's definitely falls into realistic fiction. But I've never read it because I don't like realistic fiction, versus everything else, because you think this small, narrow sliver of all of fiction is the only worthy fiction to read and publish. And it's just elitist, that's all it is. Elitist, snobbish, and frankly, narrow-minded. And I don't know why you think that it's anything but those things. You're not expanding anyone's mind by forcing them to read what you prefer. You're just kind of being a bully. And for now, we seem to be letting you get away with being that bully. And honestly, writers need to start treating this as it is, which is bias towards one genre and the pushing exclusively of that genre. And we need to start ignoring those who only like realistic fiction, for those of us who don't want to write it, don't want to read it, and don't want to participate. Because reading should be escapist, writing should be escapist. And trying to force people in someone else's narrow worldview is anything but. It's restrictive, and it's frankly quite rude. So, those who are proponents for literary fiction know that you're staring at genre fiction is, well, cognitively dissonant, because all fiction has a genre. You are just elevating your preferred segment of fiction above all others and sneering at everyone else for the term that actually applies to what you're elevating. And you need to come to terms with that yourself, I suppose, or not. I'm not here to change your mind about science fiction or fantasy. I'm just here to point out your hypocrisy. Especially considering there are stuff that's now considered classics that are archetypical literary fiction, genre fiction books like Frankenstein or stuff by Ray Bradbury. Those are both science fiction, or the case of Frankenstein, technically science horror. And you don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to say classics are only those stuff like War and Peace that are realistic fiction. And also say, oh, well, Bradbury's a classic, wrote a classic for 450 Fahrenheit 451, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's a classic. You don't get to say that in the same breath as we don't like genre fiction. So, as for everyone else who agrees with me about this whole bewildering state of affairs, well, not bewildering, stupid state of affairs, we need to start ignoring them wholesale. And a lot of us are, I think. From all the articles I found online about this topic, I didn't find a single person defending this stance. I just found people questioning this stance. So we just need to keep questioning it further and relegate these people and their self-imposed exiles off to the side and leave them in peace, and try not to let them influence what we like, because in the end, that's personal. I personally don't like realistic fiction, but I can understand why people would. And I can understand why people wouldn't like science fiction the way I do, or fantasy the way I do. All comes down to choice. It's just these people seem to think that they are the tastemakers for everyone, and they're the ones who often end up in charge of publications. And you know what? With the way print media is going, which is self-published or digital, maybe it is time to let this relic of the past be relegated to the past. But that's all I'm going to say for that.